Good evening, I am Callie Nicholson and I'm the EcoBuild Marketing Director, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening to the very first in a series of events in partnership with Wavin about water matters. In a moment, I'm going to hand over to Mike Shaw, Head of Marketing at Wavin, who's going to say a few words before we hand over to Janet, our chair of the debate this evening. But before I do that, I'd like to point you to our other events and projects on this very important topic that we're also hosting in partnership with Wavin. We've already launched the Water Matters portal on the Building Magazine's website, which has a number of expert bloggers and white papers. And next month, we'll be hosting a Water Matters webinar with Building Magazine on a topic of building on brownfield sites. So look out for details on how to join that one shortly. And then on the 26th of November, we'll be hosting a Water Matters breakout session at our Building Live conference in the city. For this session, we've already signed up Peter George, Enfield Council's Programme Director, as well as Mike Moriarty, Construction Director of Wessex Water. And the idea is really to help you understand what water clients really want. As experts in the sector, we'd really like your feedback as to the specific areas to focus this important agenda in 2016. And as such, we have a limited number of free places for our Building Live conference, which we would like members of this group to attend. And we'll be in touch regarding places to that event. But that's enough for me. I hope you enjoy this evening's debate, the drinks and the networking. And I shall now hand over to Mike Shaw, Head of Marketing at Wavin. Thank you.
Thanks, Callie. I'll keep this short, but just to explain who Wavin is first, really, we're a leading manufacturer, leading UK manufacturer of products for the construction industry, in particular those that go into water supply, water drainage, water management. So we definitely believe that water matters. What we're unsure about is whether enough people think so as well. Lots of focus on energy and renewables and carbon, but just not so much on water. The turnout tonight tells me that people do think that water matters. So we're very proud to sponsor this programme. It's running over a year, as Callie says. Lots of different events. We're going to be involved in all of them. I hope you get something from all the events, and in particular tonight, I think is a great one to start off with. A bit of an interesting subject matter, and I'm sure that Janet is going to bring out the best of the four guys on the panel here. So I'm going to hand you over to Janet, your host for tonight. Janet Street Porter. Thank you very much.
Right. Okay, just get. Well, when I was asked to chair this debate, I did have a bit of an anxiety attack because water figures very large in my life. First of all, you may or may not know that I started off training as an architect. And the first exam that I failed was called Movement, which involved moving water. So obviously, at the age of 19, I had very little concept of the problems that people face with excess water. And the second reason why I'm very interested in the subject matter tonight is that I actually live in just outside Whitstable in Kent, approximately 10 feet from the sea wall. So flooding is never far from my mind. I think it's an incredibly important subject, and we've decided to structure the evening as follows. We've got four experts sitting here, very close to you, so no physical contact, please. They're going to introduce themselves and set out their stalls in a moment. And first, I'd like to say a few words about what our overarching theme is this evening. First of all, I was told the title was The Next Big Flood, Why We Won't Be Ready. Well, I thought that was a little bit negative. What I've decided to do is introduce an element of audience participation. So you haven't got buzzers, but I'm going to ask for a show of hands at the end of the evening. So the big question is, the next big flood, are we prepared? And the people on the panel this evening are going to say whether they think we are or we aren't, and I'm going to be asking them various questions along the way. So after they made their initial statements, I'm going to ask them some questions, and then if we have any time left over, we're going to throw it to questions from the floor. So the idea is that it lasts about 45 minutes, so hopefully I'll have time for some of your questions, and don't get the hump if I haven't. Right, flooding. It is big news, and it affects so many people in Great Britain. When I was given the briefing papers for this evening, there were some really stark statistics that brought it home to me. 1 in 6 properties in the UK is at risk of flooding. That's 5.2 million homes. Almost half of them, 2.4 million, are at risk from flooding from the rivers or from the sea. 500,000 are at significant risk. That's probably my house, but there you go. Another fact which I found really bothering was the news that only half of the people, just over half, 55% of the people who live in flood risk areas are actually aware of the fact they could be flooded. So that just seems that there's a big knowledge gap there. The second thing about flooding is how it impacts on all of us through the cost to the economy. Floods, the cost of repairing after floods and managing flood risk costs our economy £2.2 billion every year. And that breaks down into 800 million spent on flood and coastal defences and an astonishing £1.2 billion in damages. And experts reckon that figure could rise to an annual cost of £27 billion a year by 2080 unless we do something about it. The second lot of costs are the cost to the insurance industry. They have been estimated at £4 billion over the last 10 years. And the clear-up costs of the flooding in 2014 was £1 billion. So you can see that flooding affects a huge number of people in this country and costs the economy an awful lot of money. So I'd like to turn to my panel and give them 5 minutes, a ruthless 5 minutes each, to state who they represent, what their area of expertise is, and how they respond initially to my provocative question, are we prepared? So let's kick off with Alison Baptiste.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name is Alison Baptiste, and I work for the Environment Agency. Apologies to those that can't see over there. I hope that you can still hear. Well, as Janet has very clearly described, and we've all seen in the media over many years, floods happen. They've happened for centuries, and they will continue to happen. And with climate change, we're seeing that more extreme events are going to happen more frequently into the future. And because we all like to live and work by rivers and by the sea, the Thames is only a short walk away from here, and Janet lives on the beach, as you've heard. That puts pressure on us in order to be able to protect people and property and to prepare for floods that will come. So our job, and when I say our, I mean Environment Agency, government, local authorities, water companies, contractors, consultants, builders, journalists, emergency response, and those of us who live and work in a floodplain. Our job is to understand the risk and to do something about it, and to prepare so that when it does happen, we are well prepared for it. So I see that we all have a part to play. The Environment Agency setting strategy, allocating funding for flood defences, warning people, informing, and the construction industry in building resilient properties, in producing innovative products like Wavin do with regard to how we can manage water, and building flood resilient buildings. So I thought we would just look back a bit as to what we've done in recent years. And I thought I'd look back about just over 60 years. 1953 is well known as the big coastal flood. which over 300 people died in the UK and 3,000 in the Netherlands. We had a very similar event in December 2013. It featured in the press for a couple of days, and then Nelson Mandela died. And because the impact of those floods was much, much reduced from what it was 60 years previously, it disappeared off the agenda. So just to compare, 60 years ago, there were 24,000 properties flooded, and there were 2,000 2 years ago. 300 deaths, and there were no deaths this time. Agricultural land, 65,000 hectares were flooded, this time just under 6,500. In 1953, there was one flood warning issued, one telephone call to the police in Norfolk. This time, over 160,000 direct messages went to people's homes, to their mobile phones, to their tablets, to their iPads, to warn about the flooding and to direct people to take action. So we've invested in flood defences. The tidal walls here, the Thames barrier further down, and all the walls and barriers down the east coast we have built in response to those floods. We now have an expert flood forecasting and warning service. We had no warning in 1953. People were going out to a dance on Southend Pier when people were dying in Scotland. Whereas 2 years ago, 6 days out, we knew that there was very likely to be a major surge. And so we could plan, we could evacuate. 18,000 people were evacuated by local authorities, and we could respond to the risk that was coming and to minimise the impact.
Alison, I'm going to have to wind you up in a minute.
So, what are we doing looking forward? We've got record investment coming through over the next 6 years, with investing 2.3 billion in defences. We're investing in social media on Twitter so that we can warn people. And we're working with partners so that if we do our bit, they can do theirs. So in response to your question, Janet, will we be ready? I think that if we all do our part, then yes, we will be ready. We're doing our bit in the Environment Agency and with government. My question here is, are you doing yours?
Right, thank you. Our next speaker is Will McBain. Will.
Thanks very much, Janet. I'm Will McBain. I'm an Associate Director with Arup. I've come all the way down from Yorkshire, Ilkley, today to be with you, and most of the work I do is up in the north of England on the Humber, places like Sheffield and Leeds, but I also work with Arup sort of globally in the field of flood risk management and have done for about 20 years. On a positive note, I would like to start my 5 minutes with a defence of the industry in this country, the flood risk management industry, of which many of you are part. I think we need to remind ourselves that we have one of the leading R&D programs in the world in terms of this area. We have huge amounts of collaboration done through professional institutions such as CIWEM, Chartered Institute of Water and Environmental Management, Janet, the ICE, Institute of Civil Engineers, Construction and Information and Research and Information Association, Syria. We are the envy of the world in terms of our flood mapping capability. We have a national flood maps which are actually rather better than FEMA's in America. There are British companies that won awards for innovation in mapping Thailand, flood maps of Thailand. We're doing flood maps in British companies are doing flood maps in countries all over the world, and people follow our lead in that area. Also, in terms of how we manage our assets in this country, in terms of flood defence assets, that is, the system that is used primarily by the Environment Agency to record the condition of those assets, to look at the pressures that they face hydraulically from rivers and the coast, and the consequences of their failure, is very impressive. And that is a very, very sound basis on which to prioritise investment. And finally, capital investment in terms of spending on new defences. The Dutch admit that we are way ahead of them in terms of the methods we use to make sure the money we spent gets best value for the taxpayer. So I want to start with that very positive note, but my following minute will be on why we probably won't be ready for the next flood. It's not because the industry isn't excellent. We have the skills, we have the technology. The reality is, I think flooding's been called a Cinderella issue, and we don't spend as much money as we should do. The average benefit cost ratio of schemes being built in this country remains about 15 at the moment, and to qualify for funding you need to have a benefit cost ratio of about 8. The average transport scheme would be lucky to get a benefit cost ratio of 2. In fact, they'd be jumping up and down with delight if they managed to achieve those kinds of benefit to cost ratios. So it is a bit depressing that we're not spending more. The manifestations of this on the ground are that there are a large number of communities that are currently at probably what we consider unacceptable risk, that will probably not get the protection in time for a surprise not to occur at some time in the near future. Our critical infrastructure systems, 2007 and then 2013-14 reinforced the point that our critical infrastructure systems are very exposed. I think there are 14,000 electricity substations in the floodplain in this country. Now that whole asset base is based on the current hydrological system. As that shifts, we need to build resilience in it, and that's a very long process. It doesn't happen overnight, and it takes concerted investment as part of asset management, business continuity, and climate change adaptation programs, which people are trying to push for, utilities are trying to push for, but economic regulators are saying, well, hang on a minute, the customer's not ready to spend this amount of money, we need to do it more slowly. So I think all flood events test the mettle of our infrastructure systems, the readiness of our communities. We can't prepare for every eventuality. By definition, the next flood will take us by surprise because it tests an aspect of our built environment or our community resilience that hasn't been tested before. So it is guaranteed that we will be taken by surprise at some point. The trick is to make sure that our efforts, that we invest in efforts to reduce flood risk and raise awareness of the issue and build resilience at a rate which outstrips the extent to which flood risks are rising. And flood risks are rising both because of climate change, but also because of we're a very crowded nation, and it's very, very difficult to build new infrastructure without increasing the risk to some extent, in spite of all the measures we put in place to try and prevent it.
Very good. Now, our next speaker is Sue Illman.
Right, thank you. Good evening, everyone. As I say, I'm Sue Illman. I'm a landscape architect in private practice. I specialise in SUDs. I'm also past president of the Landscape Institute and currently water champion for CIC. And I'm talking about urban flooding in particular. And what I have to say is research says it's only going to get worse. Why? 4 factors. Our cities are becoming ever denser and we're generally removing soft surfaces that can absorb water. Climate change is bringing more intense and prolonged storms. Most of our towns and cities are located historically on rivers, and when river flooding and rainwater flooding, surface water flooding come together, then definitely the problem gets worse. And more importantly, our old sewer system is a combined surface water and foul system, which just was not designed to cope with the amount of water that's now been sent down it. So that combination is pretty lethal, and if you want to live in a low-lying coastal town as well, then you really do have problems. So what we're going to do about it? Well, what we need to do is to retrofit our towns and cities comprehensively to prevent flooding, from individual houses to our businesses and to our infrastructure, and to deal with the problems that we already have, and to also build in a factor for the future as well. We've got to ensure that all new development deals with its own water adequately. So again, it doesn't contribute to the problem. And I think we should also ensure that all redevelopment also isn't let off the hook, because that's an opportunity to improve the existing situation. And in doing that, what we're going to use is a whole range of things, whether they're hard systems or soft systems, doesn't matter as long as we deal with it. But I'm going to advocate soft SUD systems because we can then get all the other multifunctional benefits that accrue if we do so. And that will allow us to improve the quality of our urban environment for everybody that lives there. We can reduce urban heat islands, we can improve air quality, water quality, biodiversity, and indeed public health. So why wouldn't we want to do that? At the same time, are we doing it, and what should we be doing? Well, in terms of new development, we all thought that we were going to get there with the final implementation of Schedule 3 of the Flood and Water Management Act, and that was until it was hijacked by DCLG at the end of last year, which essentially emasculated the approach that had been set out, and which would have dealt with all development everywhere. We're consequently left in something of a muddle of not knowing what's required, what's acceptable, can it be adopted or not, who's going to maintain it. And because it's not mandatory, those not wishing to do it have got the get out built into the guidance by you can then use the arguments of it's not appropriate or indeed it's too costly. Flooding is too costly. It's too costly for the people that suffer it. And of course that, as I say, it doesn't apply to everything, only to major development. In terms of retrofit, I think the good news is that lead local flood authorities, the councils are developing their surface water management plans, and many of them have started to implement a number of schemes. And there's some really interesting and good work going on there. But ultimately, it's all relatively small beer. A street here, a school there, a local park somewhere else, or an estate. But it's not enough in terms of what we need to do. They all help, and I'm an absolute advocate of nibbling, as you'll see from my badge. Let's do it, lots of interventions, and in towns and cities we have to do lots of interventions because they build up. Let's nibble at the problem and let's try and solve it. But what we're not doing is dealing with it comprehensively, and it's only if we look at every intervention that we make in the urban environment and say, what can we do, or can we do something to improve flooding, that we will really, really start to make a difference. But that requires a different mindset, it requires leadership, and it needs a significant resource and funding. I say resource and funding to make it happen. And it needs really joined up thinking between everybody that's involved in the built environment.
Right, I'm going to nag you a bit now, Sue.
I'm nearly there. So I was saying from the planning authority, from highways through to the planners, we've got to work with the water companies, with developers, with business people, and indeed all of us, the population at large, to understand the problem and actually get on with dealing with this. So I'm saying we've got the ability to do it, we do know what to do, but sadly I think flooding will continue.
Thank you. Well, we're hearing the same message over and over again, that we've got the skills, we've got the wills, we've got the knowledge. But now I'm going to ask Peter here to talk about things from the construction industry point of view. We've got the knowledge, can we do it? Can we
Great.
build it?
Good evening. Thanks, Janet. And yeah, I am going to pick up on a few of the themes that the others have talked about. Firstly, just let me say, I'm Peter Cablehorn. I'm from the Construction Products Association. And of course, we're delighted to count Wavin as one of our members. We represent about 85% of the construction products industry in the UK. So my sort of approach to this in talking about the construction industry generally is my training was as an architect, so I was actually, like Janet, looking at interesting problems about 30 years ago. I did pass some of that stuff, so hopefully I can go on and talk a bit more about it, but sorry about that. Anyway, so really what I want to focus on is what's the construction industry's response to this particular problem? What is there that we can hold on to in terms of innovation, mitigation products and stuff like that? Well, let me say firstly that, of course, if you look at this from a build point of view, from a construction point of view, it is a complicated problem. As we've heard, floods by their very nature attack us in different ways, and they're quite spontaneous. And a bit like some of the other things that we have to deal with in the built environment, you can only prepare so much. And the question for designers and for product manufacturers is, how much is enough? And I think that is a really difficult thing to answer, because as the designers of the Titanic found, they obviously didn't do enough. And yet they thought that they had an unsinkable boat. So what have we got in the construction industry today that gives us some confidence? We do have a very broad collection of materials and products which are resistive to flooding if they're used properly. We do have materials that you can use in just about every part of a home that will make it fairly resistant to flooding.
That's not to say that it can resist all levels of flood, as I was just pointing out. So we have, for instance, floor finishes, which actually can take complete immersion in water. We have wall finishes, plasters that actually don't absorb water these days. So we have those kind of products that people can use and specify. We also have doors and windows which will take a fair amount of flooding. But when you get on to things like insulation, when you get on to the more cosy things that all of us like to have, particularly in homes I'm talking about now, it gets really complicated because basically they are difficult to make in forms that will be flood resistant. So we're always going to end up, I think, with a partial problem that you can't totally cope with. And also, if we look at homeowners, they don't want to have a house that is completely resilient to water ingress, because actually it starts to look a bit like a prison. So that's really not very helpful. And then we start to look at construction techniques. Houses in particular, but buildings in general, do end up with a lot of unseen cavities behind the finishes. Those cavities, when a building floods, tend to retain moisture and are very difficult to dry out. So we've got to have some sort of rigour in how buildings are constructed if they are going to resist any sort of flooding and moisture. So I think that there's a number of things where we can be optimistic about, but there's also a lot of complex issues which we really haven't got to grips with in terms of how we deal with this. So industry is researching. There are new products turning up on the marketplace. There are new materials being investigated to be water, not only water resisting, but they actually throw off water, so they repel water. And some of those materials really can give us hope for buildings which sit there and do their job properly in time of flood. We also have sort of retrofit products which can be used to block up doorways, to block up drains, to deal with that first line of approach. And we also have products now that people can roll out, such as bunding and barriers. So if we've got notice, as we were saying, that where flooding is going to happen, then you can prepare. And we've seen in the media recently where local authorities have invested in particular products which can be rolled out to prevent serious flooding. But we also have still remaining problems with things like electricity, gas, IT. They really take a pounding when flooding occurs, and unless you raise it all up and assume that a building is only going to flood to a certain level, then we're in problem with them as well. And I think that the future will tell us whether we can actually ever case harden those kind of things going forward when we're looking at things. But if I sort of step back from this a little bit and say, well, picking up a theme that Sue mentioned, at grassroots level, the application of all these good things is chaotic. It isn't governed by any straightforward process. I mean, it is any code of practice that covers this is welcomed because it gives people a sense of direction.
We're going to come on to that in a minute because we're running out of time.
I'm running out of time. I'm on card 3. I'm nearly there. Yeah. Okay. So we can sort of look at this and say what we need is some sort of cohesive approach. And I've just got to mention, I came across recently kitchen fittings which can completely be put underwater and just dried off and they're still perfect. So that's a really good innovation as far as I'm concerned. But just finishing off, Janet, the challenges to us is how do we bring these products together in a concerted effort? And I would believe that one way we can do it is to look at some form of building regs that will enable us to actually say, in difficult areas, you have to do that. Because at the moment we have a standoff between developers and local authority, and nobody wants to take on the investment, nobody wants to bite the bullet and get on with it. So my attitude is to hell with everything and let's regulate.
Right, now, I know I'm supposed to be a neutral chair.
Go on.
But I'm just going to say one thing to you straight away. You talked about all these fabulous products. You talked about all the research and development that's going into them.
Yeah.
At the same time, we're living in, as George Osborne has said, the age of austerity, cost cutting, and so on. So the government says we've got to build 200,000 homes a year. You know, we've got to roll out this new build strategy, which obviously we're not ever going to succeed at. But what if those houses use all your fabulous products? What does it add to the cost per square foot? Does it make that house cost 50% more? Just give me a percentage.
Well, yes, you're putting me on the spot, aren't you?
Yeah, because that's my job.
So, right, okay.
That's why they got me, journalist.
Great. Right, don't quote me on this, and you're not going to. But I would say, off the top of my head, it's about a 10% surcharge. Okay,
so to not be flooded, you've got to be prepared to spend, or to be flooded and deal with it in an acceptable way.
Bearing in mind, it's not perfect.
It's not perfect, but the minimal personal, mental trauma and the you can get back in your house quicker will cost you 10% more to build those kind of houses.
But what you've also got to bear in mind is what Will was saying is that what's the cost benefit? Because if people have to move out of houses, if they've got all sorts of knock-on problems with that, the cost of the insurance, the horrible waste, because we're meant to be thinking about sustainability these days, of people just throwing away full.
So you're spending money to save money.
Correct.
So the next question I want to put to the panel is, I've heard everything you've got to say, and you're all, from all of your different perspectives, it sounds like you're all doing good work and you've all got solutions, but you rely on the government having a strategy. Everything you do is nothing. You can't implement it without a directive from above. So I don't know who wants to answer this first, but do you think that the government really takes the issue of flooding seriously? Does it have an overarching strategy beyond warnings and tweets and everything else?
I think that's one for you, Alison, to kick off.
Certainly, from where I sit, I am the Director of Strategy and Investment for the Environment. So we have a strategy. We have a National Flood and Coastal Erosion Risk Management Strategy. It came out after the Flood and Water Management Act in 2011, and it sets out the government's plan for how we respond to flood and coastal risk, which is very much about understanding the risk and reducing that risk through prioritisation. But as I said earlier, so we have that strategic direction and we have government investment.
But do you have the funding?
We have government investment. But what we do through the government funding is providing defences like the Thames Barrier. What we don't do is build houses. We advise local authorities where they should be built. If they want to build in a floodplain, we advise how they should build that. But the accountability for building properties in a resilient way and in a flood risk-free area, that comes down to local accountability with local councils deciding it and the developers building it. So we can set the strategy, we can build the defences on the main rivers and on the coast, we can warn and we can do our bit, and that's why I say we work in partnership and we need the local authorities and developers to do the same.
So what you're saying is you've got a strategy but they can just ignore it. Will, what do you think?
They can't, Janet. I think we're on extremely dangerous territory if we start talking about building new houses that are designed to flood safely. I think that's an excellent strategy for retrofitting our existing properties, of which there are hundreds of thousands of properties out there that are in flood risk areas. If they flood, it is a nonsense for the same deep carpets and television, the same stuff to be put back, and this is something the insurance industry has been grappling with a lot. But it's fundamental, isn't it? If you have a load of valuable stuff on your ground floor and you flood, you shouldn't be putting back the same stuff. You should be putting back different stuff that is flood resilient. But that is existing property. New property should be built such that it is safe from flooding. Full stop. We shouldn't be designing new buildings such that water actually comes into homes. We haven't got that desperate.
Insurance won't put back different because it's betterment. We've had this argument with the insurance company for many years, and of course, if an insurance company, a house floods, they put back quarry tile floors instead of fitted carpet. It does cost more. Next year, where's that person going to go for their insurance? The chances are they'll go to a different company. So they don't see the return on it. I've been talking to Brendan McCafferty from Flood Re and the insurance industries about what we can do to try and lever in some funding so that we can actually put in resilience into those existing properties. It is about working together, each of us doing our part.
But Mary, Queen of Floods, Mary Donau, who was former Flood Forum chair, she flooded on a regular basis and she completely retrofitted her home so that she can get back to normal within a few days of flooding. And it's the same in the King's Arms in York. That pub will flood. The next day they're back in business because they've thought about it and they've invested a bit of money that saved themselves a fortune. And you've got to pay the excess on your insurance, don't forget.
So do you think there is the government is too reliant on local authorities to implement their strategy?
I think that lead local flood authorities is a new thing. So these lead local unitary or county councils, such as Hertfordshire, we have a representative here, have a huge amount on their plate, and they have been given these new duties to coordinate local flood risk. And that's a hell of a thing to do because you're coordinating all the water companies, the Highways Agency, the Highways Authority, Highways England, and internal drainage boards and the local communities, and they're trying to build resilience through this partnership funding mechanism, and it's very difficult to attract this partnership funding. There isn't a lot of cash around, so a lot of money is being spent by local authorities trying to put together business cases to build resilience, herding these cats, trying to herd them in the right direction. It's very time consuming, and with austerity coming, there is a genuine concern that the local authorities will struggle to cope in fulfilling that new duty. And in the meantime, there's been a 40% reduction in development control staff within the Environment Agency, who've always in the past been there to give valued guidance to local authorities on flood risk issues. So that is also a concern.
Sue, what would you like to add?
Going back to your question really about housing, what you've got to bear in mind is there's plenty of houses that have already got permission that haven't been built that are in areas at risk of flooding. You've also got to bear in mind that there's different zonings for flooding as to the likelihood of how much they will flood, and that will affect whether or not they get planning permission and what has to be done about it. And one of the problems that we've got is that we are seeing schemes that are getting permissions and that they are not addressing the issue. And because of the change in the way that it's being delivered, and it's now through this system of guidance, planners are seeing it as another factor in the planning mix, not as an essential thing. And so that's not always the case. It does depend on the authority, and that clearly there are those who are absolutely up to speed and they've got all of their policies and their supplementary planning guidance all in place, and they know what they're doing, and they're well resourced, and they use their lead local flood authority to get good guidance on planning applications. But that is not true throughout the whole country.
From where I'm standing, it sounds it's a bit of a postcode lottery.
Yep.
So it depends on planners, and we all know, I don't know if you're a planner or not, but I built 2 houses, so I'm very familiar with the planning laws of this country, and planning is so hard to understand from the outside. It can be interpreted all sorts of different ways, and now we've heard that the government wants to make planning easier, which I always think is a bit of a worry. It should be more difficult, so that less rubbish was built. But when it comes to flooding, surely it should be a uniform requirement.
Of course it should, and that was the way we were going until it was changed a year ago.
Yeah.
And that's really the problem. And it's a burden that's been put on the planners that it's not. Planners are not drainage engineers. It's not their job. Their job is to determine planning applications and to plan for development at the strategic level based upon a whole different set of criteria, and they're being asked to make judgment on things when sometimes they might get a planning application with about that much of computer modelling and statistics. Where do they start? And they're not necessarily getting the funding to be able to get the resource to assist them in making those decisions. So inevitably, and particularly if you are going to see authorities where it is just seen as just another part of the planning mix, then you're going to see bad decisions increasing in a way that we were gearing up to a system, and the authorities were upskilling and they were setting up their what were SABs, the SUDS approving bodies, and we were heading in a direction, and we've just gone backwards. Now, no doubt it will level off after a time, perhaps, But the problem, what we're not ever going to see is if we're only ever dealing with major applications and worrying about those significantly. I have to say, a lot of development in this country, a very significant part is minor development, and so all of that is not being addressed. So
can I bring Peter in here and ask that? Speaking from the perspective of the construction industry, would you like uniform regulations applied throughout the country?
Absolutely, Jan. I think again, just picking up from Sue's point of view and trying to answer your question, I think that where we take that is the fact that the solutions that you put onto any site and any particular dwelling are technical, and technical resolution is technical resolution is dealt with by building regs. We have a perfectly adequate set of regulations in this country that deal with radon. So anywhere where a house is built where we have exposure to radon, i.e. radioactive ground rocks, that is dealt with by a set of the regulations, and builders understand completely what the response is, and you have to deal with it in a technical way. If we were to apply the same principle in terms of houses that have a flood risk, you can apply a similar set of technical rules, and effectively the construction industry will respond to that by saying, okay, I know what I've got to do, and I do it. What we absolutely need is a level playing field, but what we also absolutely need is clarity, both for constructors but also for building users. So, you're used to buying a house and identifying what the energy rating. All right, we could debate that another day, but you can actually buy a house and have some confidence that you know what it's about. You should also be able to buy a house where it says, okay, you are in a flood risk area, but its grade of flood resilience is X, Y, and Z.
Right, now, another question I'd like to ask you all. I've heard, I find it rather bothering that this can vary so much from one part of the country to the other. There's no overall standard. Do you think that more investment is needed in flood defences and in resilience?
It's an interesting point. We're talking about homes, but there's also infrastructure systems.
Yes, exactly.
And after 2007, Syria got together a project looking at the flood resilience for critical infrastructure systems, which involved all the utility companies, rail providers, highways providers coming together to discuss this issue of standards. And one of the recommendations of that report was that we should look, as an industry, to develop performance standards and minimum standards for our systems. The Cabinet Office at the time was quite resistant to that idea. They think, well, it's up to you as your infrastructure operators to come up with appropriate standards for your individual assets. So here we are 5 years later, and we had a workshop last week talking to people who've gone away and sort of done their own thing. And the danger, there's been some great stuff done, but it's been done almost in isolation. And even within organisations such as National Grid, who are grappling with this issue, they're appointing a number of consultants who are coming back with different solutions in terms of how they deal with flow estimation, how they calculate freeboard and uncertainty, what allowances they factor in for climate change, increase in river flow and rainfall. And there is a lack of consistency, which is not helpful. So I think there is a need for improved guidance to all operators on this issue.
If you look at something like high-speed rail, for example, when you're planning a railway line from scratch, you build flood, the probability of flood into it. But given that our railway system in this country was developed over a century ago, and we saw in the floods in 2014 the main line to the West Country, all communication to the West Country severed. It was almost like going back to the pre-industrial age. Do you think that enough money is being allocated to, or that train operators, the existing network rail, are allocating enough money now to sorting out the problem, as it currently stands? Because I use the East Coast line all the time, and at regular intervals, the line's flooded, even on that line.
Well, I think that illustrates the point about these things taking time, because Network Rail had gone away and they've done a major research program called Tomorrow's Railway and Climate Change, and they're looking at a concerted investment over the next decades to try and bring this huge asset base up to improved standards. So you don't have brand spanking new bits of railway which are protected with 1,000 year standard.
But they've got to make it a priority in their business plan, haven't they?
They do, and they've got a strategy, and it has been approved. And I think there is a genuine desire in the OR, the Office of Rail Regulation, there's a genuine desire to make this happen. But they're still at a stage where it's difficult to understand. Well, I'm not closely involved with the project, but I imagine the difficulties they're having is whether you go out and on a risk basis invest a huge amount of money in upgrading the system, or whether you're better having fantastic systems such that when a flood does happen, you can respond really efficiently and get things up and running quickly.
I want to ask Alison about
which is more
this.
Reactive.
I see what you're saying. I want to
proactive,
ask Alison, because you've talked about coastal defences and rivers and warnings and all of that, but communications networks and things used by everybody like roads and railways, how can you have an impact on the railways, for example, which are privately owned?
Okay. Well, it's interesting you raise that, because last year, after the 13-14 floods, there was a big debate at the Royal Society about the transport resilience to extreme events, and the rail network were there, the roads, power, utilities and so on. And I think it has really been a bit of a wake-up call. The 2007 floods that put the Mythe water treatment works out of action around Tewkesbury for a couple of weeks, the 13-14 floods with the Dawlish rail, but also the Port of Immingham got very close to being flooded, and that has 60% of our coal, lots of our palm oil there, so it's key on that. So I think the infrastructure providers are much more waking up to the need to be more resilient to extreme weather events, including flooding. And we're convening a conference next spring where actually we've got a major infrastructure part of it in Flood and Coast 2016, where we've got big infrastructure providers coming there from Gatwick Airport, from Network Rail, to debate how they can work together. Because it's not just about protecting their own infrastructure. Network Rail was saying they weren't that coordinated with the road, with Highways England, to ensure that when Dawlish went down, and they recovered it incredibly quickly, but to have that link in with National Express so that the road network was still kept open. So I think they've been looking at their own resilience after the 2007 floods. After 13-14, they were looking much more in an integrated way, and that's what the Royal Society called for. And so what we do as the Environment Agency, what we can help them with is really understanding that risk and what they can do about it. But it is for those infrastructure providers, as Will was saying, it's their accountability to look after their own assets. From the Environment Agency, with government funding, our aim is to protecting people and property.
So you can't make it, because of your remit, a statutory requirement to protect the railways.
No, but
so it
what
has
we
to
do,
it's not enshrined in law. Even though the railways are used by everybody, because they're privately owned, you can't make them bring the railways up to flood-resistant standard.
Network Rail has a duty to maintain its network, so that is a duty for that industry. What we've been doing with the water industry after the 2007 floods is to work with Ofwat. So part of the price review requires those water companies to invest not only in environmental improvements, which is obviously another part of our ethos, but also about making their infrastructure resilient. Because it was interesting that in 2007, there was a lack of water for about 20,000 properties around Tewkesbury, and in fact Sue was saying that she was on standpipe and Bowsers at the end of the road for a couple of weeks, not because a property flooded, but because the water treatment plant flooded. That was a real wake-up call, and I think the water industry is really beginning to respond to it.
Okay.
And on a positive note, that water treatment works has got infrastructure in place, has a Neeps and substation, has most of the bits of equipment that went down in 2007. The infrastructure is in place, and there are some fairly major investment programs that are going on that we don't know about really, but they are happening in the background.
Good. Now, we've overrun slightly, so I've got time for a couple of questions from the audience. So, anybody got a question they want to put to the panel? Yes. Do you want to say who you are first?
I'm Didi. I'm a design consultant. I'm more concerned about the public health issue and the spread of disease through water. You can have these lovely modern buildings, but you will have these people living in them with 15th or 14th century medieval diseases. And how can that impact on society as a whole? And should we be campaigning or raising awareness right now in schools?
Public health issues. Anybody got control?
It's interesting. We've been looking very much from a technical perspective, as Will's been describing, about defences that we put in place and whether a property is flooded and whatever. But particularly after the recent floods, there's been much more information from Public Health England, not only about the diseases from the waterborne, but also the psychological trauma of flooding and the impact that that has on particularly children, but also adults, and the productivity and the issues that that brings to their workplace. It's not something that we within the Environment Agency lead on, but it is something that we are working with Public Health England and with other foundations like the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, who are looking at that and how it impacts particularly vulnerable communities. And in fact, the government's prioritisation system does favour vulnerable communities. Whether it does it enough is a debatable point, but we are looking that way. But I think there's far more to do on it.
Yeah.
I don't know if others would...
Hang on, you've only one question, sorry. I'm sorry, you can't have a supplementary because we're running out of time. Yes.
My name is Victor Cherubin. I was a shipbroker, and 35 years ago we saw the Thames barrier being built, and I was working in the Thames, so I knew exactly what the Thames barrier was going to do for us. Because of that, we have had a great amount of saving. Now, I feel there is need for another barrier further up the river, down the river, so that we can have this problem of water once and for all solved. We're tinkering with so many things.
Okay, where would you cite your barrier number 2?
I don't know. It will be somewhere.
Well, because the Thames Estuary, there's birds there. We don't want the airport there.
Only a property developer. All I can say is that we need another barrier, even if it means another 20 years. We are an island. We cannot afford to go without a barrier.
Okay, right. Gentleman at the back there. Yeah.
Oh, you get a response?
Okay, do you want to respond? No.
Yeah, no, you.
All right, Richard Barnes from the Woodland Trust. I was just wondering, and perhaps it's slightly aimed at the Environment Agency, do you think enough is being done on a catchment basis to integrate what's being done with the Water Framework Directive and what's being done with the 6-year flood risk management plan, especially looking at some of the soft solutions, stemming the flow, working up in Yorkshire, Pickering, and those sort of solutions that South West Rivers Trust are looking at. We were very good to sponsor the Syene conference a year and a half ago, 2 years ago now. And I gave a presentation at that about the soft solutions, but we don't seem to have moved on from that, and there's not much integration.
Do you want me to answer? Can I answer Victor's as well?
Quick ones, yeah.
Okay, Victor, we have a strategy, Thames Estuary 2100. We're looking at how we protect the Thames Estuary over the next century. Part of the approach we're doing is about a new barrier, but what we're doing is on a no regrets basis first in looking at walls and realignment where we can, so that we delay building the barrier until we absolutely know we need to do it. We've already identified a few sites where it might be if we go down that route, and we have government support to that strategy. So we do have a plan in place for London.
And it is upheld as an international exemplar, the Thames strategy. I'd have to give the agency that.
Thank you. Well, we did pioneer a slightly new way of doing it, so thank you. And Richard, on the Woodlands Trust, I'm a civil engineer, but I absolutely support the whole soft solutions approach and slowing the flow. And in fact, the work we've been done at Pickering, I think, has been fantastic. And we're doing loads with Moors for the Future on slowing the flow on the moors, and as you've mentioned, down in the southwest. We have, within the agency, been really promoting an integrated environmental approach and a policy that we call, or a protocol we call, working with natural processes. And what that states is that we will look to use natural processes in every possible occasion. Clearly, coming through urban areas, there's not so much opportunity for it. But what we see is that we try and combine it. So in Morpeth in Northumberland, we put in some big storage reservoirs. We've been doing it for years. Down in Kent, we have a storage reservoir as well, and Lye. And what we try and also find is that where, particularly in rural communities, there may not be the funding in order to put in major defences, or the communities don't want it because they don't want walls through their communities. What we found is that working with natural processes and slowing the flow up the catchment, putting in buffer strips with the farm and working with farmers, that actually can make quite a big impact on the flooding. I'd love to see more of it. We have to do it as part of our flood response, and we have to be accountable for the money that we invest in flood defences. And so what we're trying to do is integrate it that way. And the last point, we have to do it for Water Framework Directive from European, and we adhere to that. But there's one of the initiatives we're really thinking at the moment and talking with government is about natural capital, and looking not only at flood risk on a catchment basis, but actually looking at all the natural capital on a catchment basis, so that we're not just looking about flood risk, we're looking at what the implications are for water resources, for water quality, for the environment, for land use, because so many of those can be integrated and you get multiple benefits from it. Early days on natural capital, but we're certainly taking it very seriously.
Right, thank you. Now, one last question. I want a very snappy answer from whoever answers.
Don't work in a bubble. I think all the 4 people sitting here at the table, everybody in this room, are working in a bubble. Because I think, Janet said, without blowing smoke up a backside, the public have no idea of flood risks. And the Environment Agency lady made a comment. I work in the insurance industry. The flood re comes in next year, and people start realising that insurance premiums are doubling even though they've been through flood, and they're exempt from flood protection because new people are excluded. It's on the newspapers and in the financial papers. Public opinion will start to actually.
Well, I did say before we came into this room that I wrote a piece in The Independent last week because I read that the National Trust were pontificating about mobile homes and caravan sites, the proliferation of them. And I did say that my generation, the Crumbleys, are all really loving these static caravans. And 100,000 of them are now around the coast of Great Britain, and they're multiplying at the rate of like 10,000 a month or something incredible. And I see it all around Whitstable. Everybody wants one of these homes because they're cheap, and they are all sitting right next to the sea. And I suppose the only good thing is that when it floods, they'll float away. Anyway, thank you all very much. I'm sorry, we've exhausted out. What? That's cheeky. Make it very quick.
A lot was said about the implementation of Section 32 of the Flood and Water Management Act. Can I just pick up on the fact that it got introduced with the planning system because DCLG and DEFRA between them agreed that because there was a requirement for sustainable changes under the Planning Act, that was the best place to place it to be enacted. When the new legislation came into place in April of this year, and the lead flood authorities became the statutory consultees for flood management for any new planning application. There is a set of guidance for SUBs with the national standards that have been agreed by DEFRA, HBA, HBF, and it's on their website. And every planning application has to comply with those. In terms of your comment with affordability, there are mandatory sections in that guidance that have to be adhered to. The requirement in terms of affordability is the difference between whether or not the sub is above or below ground in terms of cost. But the requirement to ensure that they do not create flooding is a mandatory requirement.
Okay, well, thank you for that clarification. Now, I've got to tell you one last thing, that a write-up of this debate will be published in Building magazine, and it will also be on the EcoBuild website. And I'm going to thank my 4 panellists, who I think have been excellent: Alison, Will, Sue and Peter. Now, my last question to you, your moment for all audience participation. I asked a question at the beginning. Are we prepared for the next big flood? So I want a show of hands. I want everybody who thinks we can be happy, sleep in their beds tonight, not worry, we're ready for the next big flood, whether it's tomorrow or over Christmas, whatever. Do you think we're ready? Hands up who thinks we are. All right, we're on the 19th floor now. How many people think? All right, assuming you're down at ground level trying to get on the underground, are we ready for the floods? I've got 1 person, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Well, you know whose house to go round to when it floods. Thank you all very, very much. Thank you very much indeed.